Strength above all else. That is the philosophy of Invincible's Viltrumites, the superhuman-like alien race within the show's universe. It's with this philosophy that Viltrumites have taken over entire star systems, expanding their empire at the intergalactic scale. And while this way of life may have carried the Viltrumites to their success, it's also the Viltrumite Empire's greatest weakness because it misunderstands what strength truly means, it invalidates systems that allow them to retain that strength over time, and it completely ignores cooperation as a form of power. And this video aims to explain why. But to get into that, I will have to talk about spoilers, so let this be your warning. And with that, let's talk about the real root of the Viltrumite ideology. Darwinism. Viltrumite society is built on the idea of survival of the fittest, that only the strongest individuals have the right to live and get to decide who else has that right as well. We've seen this on the show during the many flashbacks to when the Viltrumite Empire was much stronger than what it is right now. To remove the weakest members of their society, the Viltrumites committed the Great Purge, where the entire population slaughtered themselves until only about half of their people remained. This meant that, at least in their philosophy, the remaining Viltrumites were the most powerful and most worthy of continuing their race and legacy. They believed that they, the remaining half of the Viltrumite population, were the strongest beings in the entire galaxy. This is of course based on the idea that if you're not one of the strongest members of a species, you won't live on to see your genes passed on to the next generation. But this was also a very animalistic view of strength. Remember that Viltrumites valued combat prowess above all else, and while the remaining Viltrumites were the most powerful fighters, that's all they really were. Fighters. And the problem with that is fairly obvious. Fighters are great at combat, but not necessarily at everything else it takes to run a government, because that requires more than just throwing hands and hoping for the best. And ironically, this view of valuing strength above all else may have been the very same view that doomed their entire race. Because yes, the so-called strongest Viltrumites remain, but what do they know of sustaining an empire? If human history and my 200 hours in the Civilization series has taught us anything, it's that while military strength can help expand an empire and conquer lands that were never yours, managing those same territories is an entirely different conversation. Because running a government effectively needs more than just soldiers. It needs engineers, doctors, diplomats, bread and circuses, and so much more. Sure, the Viltrumites were powerful enough to not need to worry about any of that, but that was also their biggest mistake. Because what did the remaining Viltrumite soldiers know of managing a public health crisis? What if the Viltrumites that were killed during the Great Purge were some of the planet's most forward researchers on virology, who just happened to not be as good at fighting? The ironic thing is, in that killing half the population based purely on combat strength, the Viltrumites may have doomed even more of their own people to the Scourge virus by eliminating scientists, administrators, engineers, and other people who are important to running an empire. And even in terms of warfare, the people who make the biggest contributions aren't necessarily soldiers either. Think about the atom bomb, the most powerful weapon that humanity has ever developed, and it wasn't a soldier who created it. It was a scientist who may or may not have cheated on his wife. By valuing physical strength and combat prowess above all else, the Viltrumites have practically doomed themselves because running an empire is more than just a question of who can throw a meaner punch. And I think we should look to a historical example to really hammer this point home. Of course, I'm talking about Sparta. When you mention Sparta, most people would immediately conjure up images of a hyper-militaristic society that forced young men into warfare training at the ripe age of 7. There are also myths of Spartans tossing babies off cliffs if they were deemed too weak, and that they didn't have any real sense of culture besides warfare. Now, truth be told, actual historical evidence for Sparta being this comically militaristic is incredibly shaky, which is a phenomenon that historians dub the Spartan Mirage, but it does make for a good comparison to Viltrumites. Because when you compare the idea of the Spartans to Viltrumites, you can actually see history repeating itself. Because while much of Sparta's history is an illusion, what is true is that they did conquer and fight well, being undefeated in pitched battle for over 150 years. But in spite of this, there is a reason that Sparta was never the most dominant force on the global scale, and that's because they couldn't expand their empire. While yes, they fought and won many battles and claimed many territories as their own, once it came down to managing those same territories, that's where the Spartans struggled. See, when they conquered a territory, their subjugates would become what we now know today as helots, practically an enslaved people that the Spartans would profit off of. And history teaches us that when one party enslaves or oppresses another, there will very likely be a revolt. Thus, the Spartans had to devote valuable manpower to managing the Helots and keeping them from rebellion. And also, there just weren't that many Spartan soldiers alive to rapidly expand their empire. Remember that after the Peloponnesian War, a devastating decades-long conflict between Sparta and Athens, there were only about 3,000 Spartan soldiers left. It was by no means a walk in the park for the Spartans, even if they did find victory in the end. And you can see these historical truths reflected in Invincible's Viltrumites. Much like how Sparta didn't have the manpower to truly expand their empire, neither did Thrag and his people. The Viltrumites, as powerful as they are, simply lacked the manpower that they would need to expand their reach. Manpower that they might have had if they didn't needlessly kill half of their own people in the name of strength. And maybe they might have been genetically diverse enough to have more survivors to the Scourge virus. Though the Viltrumites did have subjugated alien races fighting for them, as we see in the Viltrumite War. But without any Viltrumites to keep them in check, they so quickly turned on their conquerors, joining the war effort and fighting for the coalition instead, as we would see in episode 6 of season 4. Which brings us to another reason why the Viltrumite Empire fell. They simply didn't have any allies. In the show, the Viltrumites were so hyper-focused on their superiority as a truth. They saw any existing power rivaling that of their species as a threat to be dealt with and handled them accordingly. Space Racer and his gun, the Sinlac Beetles, the Gildarians, and the Rognars were all powerful enough to rival the strength of Viltrumites, but instead of trying to harness their strength and work together with them, the Viltrumites simply viewed them as beneath them and attempted to remove them from the equation. And that shows the fatal flaw of the Viltrumites. They thought that they were the strongest and couldn't allow anyone else to dethrone them. Thus, anyone of near equal power they deemed as threats and never even thought of them as potential allies. And very subtly, we see this in the way Viltrumites fight on the show. See, Viltrumites very rarely, if ever, use team tactics and coordinated combat. Most of the time, when we see a Viltrumite fight, it's a one-on-one, and instead of fighting to protect or support their fellow Viltrumites, they're instead focused on eliminating threats in single combat. See, unlike humans or Thraxans or other alien races, Viltrumites are powerful enough to have never needed to rely on each other. After all, they outmatched everybody else so easily that just a single Viltrumite is enough to overpower almost any planet or even a star system. But because most Viltrumites never learned how to fight as a collective unit, they've been putting a ceiling on their own combat prowess. It's no secret that fighting as a collective unit gives you a lot more leverage in combat scenarios. Just look at how the Guardians almost took down Nolan in the very first episode of the series, and probably could have bested him if either Red Rush didn't die off rip, or they started the fight off working as a team instead of trying to take him on in a series of standoffs. Compare this instead to when Nolan was fighting his parents. His father goes for a grappling chokehold, strength for the neck, instead of restraining him and allowing his wife to finish the job. But because his arms were free, Nolan lands an uppercut and breaks from his father's clutches, living to fight another day. And we also see this with the Mark variants, who also mostly kind of just chose to work alone, and even when Omni-Mark offered to help another variant, he was told to piss off. And that Mark variant, Invincible, does end up dying. But we see how the Coalition team is able to withstand the Viltrumite attack on Telescria by working as a collective unit, protecting each other, and coming to save each other when they needed it most. In fact, the entire Coalition versus Viltrumite Empire plotline shows how a strong enough alliance is able to match and potentially even defeat a singular, stronger foe. The Coalition survived the attack on Telescria and are, as of episode 6, turning the tide on the war by working as a team and properly integrating each other, which ironically is actually how you're supposed to maintain an empire, as we see with Rome. The core issue with the Viltrumites is that they believe that strength and power should be centered on them, so they did everything they could to concentrate all of that power onto their own species, such as by quote-unquote making themselves stronger by eliminating the weak from their race, or taking down external threats. And that makes perfect sense for an alien race like the Viltrumites, who are practically immortal and live for thousands of years on end. But this created an empire that hinged entirely on the Viltrumites still being alive. If there were something that would pose a threat to their entire species, like a manufactured bioweapon, then their empire would crumble and fall. Because the Viltrumites believed that they would live forever, thus negating the need to build something that would outlast them. But the Romans didn't have the luxury of practical immortality, so they focused on establishing systems that would outlive them. The Romans established governance systems that would ensure the peaceful transfer of power. They built roads, aqueducts, and other infrastructure that would outlast the people who built them. They valued ideas and the arts. allowing them to challenge old norms and grow as a society as time went on. Another key difference is how the Romans treated the people they conquered. They didn't just enslave, but they Romanized. They taught people Latin, Roman law, customs, and political structures. They granted people Roman citizenship, trade opportunities, and more. The Romans didn't force their subjugates to become Roman, they chose to adopt Roman culture because it benefited them. The Romans were conquerors, but they didn't necessarily view themselves as superior. If they did, they wouldn't allow slaves to buy their freedom, or even allow their subjugates to become Roman citizens themselves. And that's why the Roman Empire lasted as long as it did, because instead of reserving the power for the Romans and only the Romans, they put that power into systems that were built to last and gave their people a reason to want it to last as well. This is exactly what the Viltrumites didn't do. They didn't want to elevate other races to their status, so they didn't Romanize them. They either destroyed them when they saw them as a threat, or dominated them if they were deemed useful. They propagated this idea that Viltrumite superiority is above all else, and it was this very sense of hubris that has led the Viltrumite Empire to such a decline. The fall of the Viltrumites didn't happen just because of the Scourge virus, but rather as a result of their own hubris, of being too proud to acknowledge their own mortality as a species. And I think that's whack.